Greetings and welcome to the first episode of 2024, the Faithful Presence Podcast. I am your host, Reverend Michael Langer, founder and president of Faithful Presence, a ministry here in Washington, D.C., equipping servants and leaders serving and leading in the public square through providing spiritual, emotional, relational, vocational, ideological, cultural, and evangelical discipleship. And we know that that sounds like a mouthful. If you do the acronym, it spells out service. But essentially what we're focused on here is whole life discipleship in the whole of life for the whole of the public square. We're also working hard to support local churches during this 2024 election season. And in that same vein, kind of focusing on the cultural formation piece, kicking us off this year, we have Dr. Justin Bailey, who was educated at Fuller Theological Seminary and was a student of Dr. Kevin Van Hooser, who is one of my favorite authors on all things cultural and cultural discernment. Dr. Bailey serves as the Associate Professor of Theology at Dordt University. His books include Reimagining Apologetics and his most recent work, Interpreting Your World, 5 Lenses for Engaging Theology and Culture. Dr. Bailey, welcome to the program. How are you?
Yeah, Michael, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks
for having me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. So tell us a little bit about what you do there at Dordt. What's the general kind of vibe in Northwest Iowa? Tell me that everybody there are big fans of the University of Iowa Hawkeyes, and not Iowa State, and just kind of give me a glimpse into life in Northwest Iowa at Dordt University.
Well, life in Northwest Iowa is cold currently, although it's not as cold as it has been. I mean, it was negative 40 maybe a few weeks ago. I think it's probably 40 right now. So we're 80 degrees warmer than we were before. But yeah, it's historically a Dutch immigrant community in Northwest Iowa, not far from Sioux City, Sioux Falls, rural agricultural community. So this is a Dutch community and a lot of Dutch Reformed churches. So churches in the line of Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck. And so churches in the Reformed Church of America, Christian Reformed Church. So the institution where I teach, Dordt University, has historically been associated with the Christian Reformed Church. Probably about half of our students still come from Reformed backgrounds, from Dutch immigrant communities scattered all over the United States. But the other half of our students are coming from broadly evangelical backgrounds or just broadly Christian backgrounds. And so most of what I do is teaching. So I teach in the theology department. I'm the chair of the theology department, but most of what I do is teaching in the core program. So the general education, biblical foundations for all the students. It's a class they have to take. And then I also teach capstone courses on cultural engagement. In fact, this book, Interpreting Your World, in many ways was written from and for that sort of student. So a student who's perhaps graduating college and going out into the world and looking for some tools and frameworks with which to navigate the complexity of culture. So that's mainly what I do within the theology department. I tend to focus on pastoral theology. I worked as a pastor for a little over a decade, and so I do some ministerial preparation for pre-seminary students. But for the most part, what I'm doing here is, teaching general core students the Bible and theology and ethics and cultural engagement.
Okay, so one of the members of our board of directors, Reverend Derek Buikema, pastors in Orland Park, Illinois, one of the larger conservative CRC churches. And, so I grew up in Iowa, and when I got into ministry in Iowa City in 2008, when we planted our PCA church, we would have folks come up from Pella. And it was my first experience with not all Reformed people are Presbyterian. Some Presbyterian are Dutch and Dutch Reformed, and they're not the same thing. They really don't even look alike, and they definitely don't all think alike. And then I became aware that, the corner of Northwest Iowa is also very, very Dutch. And so one of the things that Derek, my friend, has helped me to understand is that within that one of the main differences between the CRC and the RCA is the view of Christian education. And that, I believe, if I'm correct, the CRC is pro private school, not just pro private school, but like, you should do this. You will be an anomaly if you don't. And the RCA is more open to public school. And that what that creates in the Dutch Reformed community, especially as you see it maybe playing out in places like Chicago, where the white Dutch community has a tendency to move, basically to keep their culture homogenous and not physically mixing with others. So I'm interested to hear, so your interest is in cultural discernment, cultural engagement, and yet you're teaching at a seminary where I would say some people might say cultural isolation and cultural maybe disconnection, or at least in like maybe having some walls there is part of the reason why they're doing private school. So tell us what it's like helping people that can maybe come out of that. We're trying to maintain the Dutch tradition and simultaneously the Reformed tradition, which is Christ is making all things new, and we're supposed to go into all the world. What does that look like in Dort? And is there pushback? Do you get people who are like, I don't understand why you're doing this? How does that look in a Dutch Reformed community? Is that a fair question?
It's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question. And, I'll just say that I'm obviously not Dutch. I'm Filipino American, so I'm sort of outside. I grew up outside this tradition, sort of found my way into it. I went to public school. I grew up in Kansas City. So yeah, it's a surprise to me in some ways that I've ended up in Northwest Iowa after living in Los Angeles and Chicago. I always joke, the standard Chicago, Los Angeles, Iowa pipeline, but it is a tension certainly that the tradition and is well aware of, and I think there's a few things I'd say. First of all, it's interesting. Dort is named after the Synod of Dort, 1618 to 1619, from which most people associate the 5 points of Calvinism. But the reason why Dort University is called Dort University was also the synod at which there was the recommendation for Christian day school, so that all of the education of children would be robustly Christian, from a Christian worldview. And that has always been the value of Christian education within the Dutch Reformed sphere, seeking to, as you said, apply Christian faith to every single part of life, every square inch of life. And so the joke here is that, all of our classes are theology classes. Not really, but there is this sense in which what we're trying to do is say, what does it mean to be as consistently Christian, as consistently Reformed as possible in all of these different domains in which we live, in which we work. Unlike some of the Christian school history of the movement, there was not a concerted effort to there wasn't the racial element that has played out in some places. Now, in some ways that has happened anyway, just by virtue of the cultural isolationism, going to a place that everyone is Dutch, you know what I mean? And then now struggling to figure out, okay, what does it mean now when we have our communities maybe 18% Spanish speaking? And what does it mean for us to do this? What are the implications of funding and sacrificing to make sure that our children have a really robust Christian education when the reality has changed, the composition of the community has changed. I think, again, that's a live tension that we're working with. I think ultimately the idea is that this sort of, in the same way that why does anybody send their kids to Christian school or a Christian university, is because you're hoping that they have a particular kind of experience of formation as a person. So that having had that liminal experience of preparation, of discipleship, that you were then sent out into the world, into the very heart of all of these different places, industries, and spheres, and able to give a distinctively Christian voice in the way that you do it. So it's not seeking isolation for isolation's sake. It's more of like, I don't know, boot camp or something like that, where there's this very concentrated liminal experience of thinking deeply about what it means to do accounting or politics or criminal justice in a Christian way, and then going out and actually creating institutions that do that. So because of the one drawback of the isolation is that the community can become quite insular, but a benefit of the tradition is that it has tended towards incredibly robust intellectual reflection. And so if you think of the thinkers like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Wolterstorff, Richard Mao, George Marsden, Jamie Smith, who have been nurtured in this sort of Dutch tradition, it has meant that a relatively small immigrant community has produced incredibly robust intellectual resources when it comes to cultural engagement. So I, in particular, was drawn to this tradition because of its theological resources. Outside of becoming Roman Catholic, I didn't feel like Protestants had any robust theological resources for engaging with culture in a way that was really serious. And so I found that the Dutch tradition, especially Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, J.H. Bavinck, and their heirs, had done so much thinking and really wrestling with culture from a distinctively Protestant and Reformed view, that this is why I was attracted to it. And so I always joke, because as we have more and more diversity within within our community, within our university, the students, the faculty, the staff, and you're always worried you're going to, there's this sense like, are we still Reformed? Are we just kind of evangelical now? What's the difference between the two? And I always sort of joke, like, the line from Kung Fu Panda where he says, I need to save Kung Fu. I just got Kung Fu, we're like, we need to save Reformed. I just got Reformed. I just got this, I just got into this tradition. And now we're thinking that, like, maybe we want to just be broadly evangelical, and so I really, while acknowledging those real tensions that, I feel very much so living in a relatively homogenous place, although there is more diversity than you might imagine. I feel like the resources of the tradition are quite robust and exciting to get to be nurtured in this kind of environment and to get to disciple students who are going all over the world to do all sorts of things.
Well, that's good. And you guys just finished up the Iowa caucuses, and I participated in many of those when I lived there. And I always like to say when I meet people here in Washington, they're like, Iowa, yeah, what's up with that? I'm like, hey, look, man. Iowa is one of the few states that can actually pull off a caucus because our people take it seriously. They're well educated. We do our due diligence. You have to show up at a meeting. They close the doors, and then you have to debate your neighbor. Like it's not for the weak of heart. It's not walk in and check a box and walk back out. It's very participatory. It is very participatory and in a very helpful way. And so during the lead up to the Iowa caucuses, there is a disproportional amount of press that happens and op-ed pieces. And this year was no exception. In the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, they all had articles that basically said something to the effect of, what is going on with the evangelicals in Iowa? And this started, I think, back in the 2016 election. You definitely saw it in 2020. You've seen it now in the lead up for this election. And so one of the things you talk about in your book is these 5 lenses of culture. And the first one is the lens of meaning, which you relate to the lens of meaning being very similar to kind of culture as both virus and immune system. And so one of the things that seemed to be a pretty regular thread, and then I just finished Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which is phenomenal. And he talks about this phenomenon that what you would normally expect is that some of the most out there political rhetoric is, and it seems that every year the political rhetoric gets more and more intense. And I tend to subscribe to the belief that the Overton window, which is, what you can say and have it be received, has split, which is part of the reason that both camps are moving away from each other so fast. But that what they seem to be saying, even though they're not evangelicals writing these articles, is, hey, the church is supposed to mitigate some of this. But yet it seems as though at many of these rallies, it is in fact the church that is perpetuating the kind of over-the-top language. You may remember this, but back in 2018, I think it was, Representative King from the Northwest Congressional District was stripped of all of his committee assignments because he was so far out there on a number of issues. And then you've had Bob Vanderplatz out now, high-level Iowa political operative, trying to help kind of steer this conversation. And it seems as though that this tradition of intellectual excellence and Christian, like what Christians are supposed to be doing, somehow seems to be operating more like the virus and less like the immune system right now. What would you, as you're forming this book, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to describe culture this way, or why this kind of was, I think, a valuable metaphor, I was taught to analyze by Kevin Van Hooser, who I love and who wrote the foreword to my book. I was taught to analyze culture as a text, right? As a world and work of meaning. And I think that's really valuable. In fact, it's one of the most valuable metaphors we can use to understand culture, but a text doesn't quite capture the way that culture is contagious, right? If I have a text, I can sort of pick it up, put it down. I may carry, it doesn't really capture the way that I carry with me the things I read, as traces in my imagination. And so I was like, oh, well, actually, we were going through COVID at the time, and I thought a virus is actually a pretty good analogy of the way that culture is contagious, the way it clings to us, the way that this sometimes happens without our consent almost, the sense that you catch a cold or there's these viral strains of culture that attach themselves to us. And then as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, that doesn't quite capture the comprehensive nature of culture. And so then I thought, well, the other way that culture works is like an immune system, which is a sort of a strategic defense system of discernment. Right. So why do certain things cling to us and certain things don't? Well, it's because we have a cultural immune system that filters the things that sort of fit the way that we see the world, that fit our sense of who we are and the belonging that we have to a particular group. And then there are things that we feel like threaten that. Right. And so what I was trying to show with that analogy was the way that, the modern ideal is that, we would just look at the data. Right. And then based on the data, we would develop positions, and then we would group ourselves together with others who see the world the way we do. And social scientific research has consistently shown it's the opposite, right? It starts out by being affiliated with a group. It usually chooses us, like you're sort of born into a place and groups and party affiliation. You root for a team, the Chiefs or whoever it is that your parents taught you to root for. And then you assume the positions of that team or of that party or of that group, and then you defend the team at all costs, right? And so in that case, then what we're after is a stable experience of meaning and belonging, and not necessarily the truth, right? Which is what, as Christians, we would want to be all about. And so this sort of helps me make sense a bit of the rhetoric that we see, and the way that, people who are purported to speak for my community, Christians, right, or evangelical Christians, or Reformed Christians, oftentimes I'm like, wow, why are they saying that? And it seems like the reason for it is because what we're after is not necessarily truth, but belonging, but meaning. We want to feel like our affiliation is safe. The groups we belong to are safe. And so this kind of, in some sense, helps me understand and have a bit more compassion for the sort of things that we're experiencing. That it's not necessarily that people are just trying to intentionally deceive. Well, in some cases, perhaps that's the case. But for the most part, people are looking for a stable experience of meaning. And so their cultural the cultural affiliations that they have and the cultural positions that they support are much more about the sort of group dynamic of feeling like I am asserting my membership in this group, I'm defending the group. And it's one of the reasons why, things can get ramped up so much, is because you're threatening my stable identity as a member of, a particular group that has some vision of what is good for community.
Okay, so you went there, and so I want to just keep right after that. You basically just said that people get triggered, right? When there's information presented to them, they just kind of get triggered. And so it's one thing to talk about this kind of anecdotally and, I see this, but in your book, you went down the road that I think there's just being a lot of work is being done right now in the area of brain science and the way that people are impacted by brain science. And you describe what happens when people are at a rally or they're presented with information that they don't like. And the very thing that you said is like, oh, well, what of course is going to click in is our biblical worldview, our biblical filters. We're going to take this information, we're going to process it, we're going to do all this thing that requires my prefrontal cortex to be working. But yet we now know scientifically that's not what happens. You want to talk a little bit about the brain science behind what you're talking about?
Yeah, there's a great study that's been cited all over the place about they took some people who described themselves as highly partisan, so they were either Republican or Democrat, and they hooked their brains up to a fMRI machine to see what happened as they were exposed to various sorts of information. And so they found that when they exposed, and so I think this was a few election cycles ago, and they found that when they exposed people to damaging information about the candidate that they were planning to vote for, that the part of the brain that lit up was not the prefrontal cortex, the rational, part of the brain that evaluates, logic and rationality, but it was the emotional centers, right? It was the sort of amygdala or the limbic system of the brain, that fight or flight response, that when we perceive a threat, it sort of goes into overdrive and looks for a way to resolve the distress that we feel. And so what they found was that when people are exposed to damaging information about the candidate that they were planning to vote for, they actually became more concretized in their support of that candidate. So it had this really counterintuitive effect because they perceived the damaging information not as something to be rationally sorted or rationally integrated into a rational decision about whether I should support this candidate or not. They perceived it as a threat, something that needed to be resolved. And so the result of this finding was that, we are when we feel threatened, when this cultural immune system feels threatened, we are almost completely unteachable. We learn almost nothing from new information. And you can see this, played out all over the place, that we can always find a way to rationalize new information in ways that fit the things that we already feel, right? The ways that we already believe. And so part of this, I think, one implication of this for cultural discernment and discipleship is that we need to take the discipleship, not just of the intellect into account, but the discipleship of the imagination, of, as you mentioned, emotional discipleship. Daniel Kahneman's famous book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, sort of goes into these two modes in which we naturally process the world. You have thinking fast, or what's sometimes called system one thinking, which is intuitive. It happens almost unconsciously. You're sort of, in order to make sense of the world, you have to sort of categorize things and jump to conclusions in some sense, sort it into boxes that you already have in place. and then thinking slow is this slower, more deliberative approach to making decisions. And Kahneman found all sorts of interesting things, like Israeli judges were more likely to give harsher sentences to defendants if they had not eaten lunch. And so it's this sense of these human embodied factors that affect these snap decisions that we make much more than we think. We tend to think, if we just present all of the biblical information, or we present all of the facts of what's actually going on in the Middle East, or if we present, and the truth is that while that's important, that's only part of the way that humans naturally navigate the world and make decisions. And so emotional intelligence, and I'd say cultural intelligence as well, is really about the integration of these two modes of thinking. So we have to both, have these long, drawn-out Christian interpretations, but we also have to form deeply Christian intuitions so that as we process the world, our knee-jerk response, or sort of the thinking fast that we do, the system one thinking, is actually being filtered through the Christian, world and life view, and not just intellectual facts. Because most of the time, even if we have all the right facts in our head, we default to system one, right? To this sort of, we're feeling threatened by something. And because we feel threatened, we're not teachable. We're not able to actually to be a generous and generative witness in the public square.
Yeah. Yes. 1,000 times. Yes. I see this playing out. And this is mainly, or in anecdote after anecdote, this is exactly what Tim Alberta talks about. Is he's at these rallies, he's talking to these people, and they say something, and then he says, well, yes, but what about this information that exists that's clearly seen and evident? And it's as though they've just not capable, as you said, they're just not capable of processing the information. It's almost like a refusal to do so, and to just state again my position. So one of the things, as I was reading this book, I thought to myself when I got into the second chapter, I'm like, oh, this is going to go down like a sideways Dorito. You use the phrase critical theory and applying critical theory. And you might be aware that critical theory is a bit of a buzzword in the evangelical world, and not a good one. Critical theory is all about Marx, and it's all about, promoting a certain agenda. And then Christopher Watkin goes and writes a book called Biblical Critical Theory, and saying, hey, let's actually use this system of thinking about culture and about how we perceive it and about how we interact with. So talk a little bit about how you unpacked that concept that wasn't invented by Marx, right? But was really kind of, I think, put into print by Marx and then developed by Gramsci. Talk a little bit about what you see as the role that critical theory plays in Christians being able to navigate the public square better.
Yeah, good. Let me say two sort of preliminary statements. And first is that there's 5 lenses in this book, and each of them sort of represents a different approach to culture and to theology and culture. And so there's the resource, there's, as I, through my studies have surveyed all the ways that people talk about culture. You have a cultural anthropology approach, which is looking for meaning. You have a religious studies approach, which is interested in ritual and the way that people live in the face of death. You have an aesthetics approach. You have an ethics approach. So that's what I'm just trying to do in all the different chapters. And you really can't leave out the critical theory approach, which is interested in power. So critical theory is basically an approach that seeks to expose the deep structures of a culture in order to change it. And so, if you think about this is not something that's new. I learned this from Kevin Van Hooser. He said that, critical theory is interested in exposing ideology and doing ideology critique, but Christianity, or even before, in the Old Testament prophets are not doing ideology critique; they're doing idolatry critique. Right? They're trying to show the ways that the cultures around them have because they have turned away from the living God towards idols, that this has naturally led to the ruin of the way that we treat our neighbors. So idolatry and injustice are always connected to each other. And so the intuition of critical theory is seeking to understand power failures in a society, the way that power is being misused to put some people closer to the center and to push others to the margins. And I felt like, okay, this is a good place to start. This is the primary way that outside the walls of the church, people talk about culture. This is the primary lens of analysis that is used, is the power lens. And I both wanted to not ignore the power lens, but I also wanted to say, this is not the only lens. And if this is the only lens we have, it's like a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. And we actually miss quite a bit of what's going on in culture if we just reduce it down to the political, if we just reduce it down to domination and oppression or something like that. So I'm sort of in this place where I have, on one side, some of my evangelical students who have a really hard time even seeing power and acknowledging power dynamics and structures of power. Everything seems to be mostly a matter of individual choice and responsibility. Then on the other side, there's a group of students or the larger culture that power is the only thing that they see. And so that's what I was trying to do in this chapter was I'll say that it is the chapter I'm least satisfied with and the one that I get asked about the most. And part of that is because it is the most perennial, the perennial topic, and people are saying, "Oh, I'm glad that you took a shot at it," because it's very difficult to get it right, okay. From one side or the other, to talk about power in a way that does justice.
I found it a word on target, as my my dear friend
thanks,
and colleague, Dr. Greg Perry would say. That was a word on target.
Oh, good, yeah. I think the critical theory obviously has been in the news, and I always wonder. I think in some ways we're sort of on the downswing of it. It's not quite as much of a hot button as it was a couple of years ago. Maybe it will go back up again as the election ramps up again. It doesn't seem to be as controversial this year as it was last year. And then this is just sort of reflecting on. I did have a student who said to me a few months ago, when I brought up critical theory, he said, "I don't know what it is, but I know I disagree with it." And that is a good picture of the first chapter, right? Yes. Of that sense of like, it's not even, we're not even thinking about what it is. Right. We're just disagreeing with it because we know it doesn't fit our party position. So, having said that, I just think that the value of critical theory alongside other lenses of analysis is it does attend to the ways that, that power has been abused, has been misused, the way that coercive power has pushed some to the margins while centering the interests of others. And I want to say, with Kevin Van Hooser and the Old Testament prophets, that to identify the idolatries in our society, the things that we have overvalued or have given a weight that it cannot bear, always will lead to injustice. And so if we're looking for idolatry, we should always look for injustice that comes along with it. If we're looking for injustice, we should always look for the idolatry that comes with it. And if there is idolatry, we also have in the Christian tradition a way of responding to that, which is iconoclasm. And iconoclasm, though, is very difficult to do well. There is a secular iconoclasm as well. It's called cancel culture, yes. Right? And this is the sense of, pulling down icons or, thinkers or people from their pedestals. And I call this an iconoclasm of cancellation. Now, there are some things that need to be canceled. There are things that need, there are reasons why people are removed from ministry or removed from office. There's a legitimacy to this. The danger, though, with an iconoclasm of cancellation is something seeks to fill the vacuum. Right. And we look for something else to put on the pedestal, and it's usually ourselves. Right. So we've pulled down this icons, and now we're going to get up on the pedestal and be the ones who are the righteous, who have all of the most up-to-date views. The alternative to that kind of iconoclasm is what I call an iconoclasm of complication. An iconoclasm of complication seeks to tell the whole story, and to complicate sort of the two easy narratives in which we are always the heroes, or in which our heroes are only heroes. So, to use an example a bit closer to home, at this institution, we really value the work of Abraham Kuyper, The apartments are named the Kuiper Apartments. The honors program is named the Kuiper Honors Program. And Kuiper, we give this to our students, and many of our students notice when they read his Stone lectures on Calvinism that Kuiper had some really racist things that he said.
Yes, he did.
And it's really important to acknowledge that, and that we sort of perform iconoclasm on this icon of our tradition. But what kind of iconoclasm do we need to perform? Is it an iconoclasm of cancellation, where we sort of deny his formative impact on our institution for good or for ill, and some of the trajectories that are still with us, ways that it led, for example, in South Africa, both to a support of apartheid, as well as the resistance to apartheid. And so to do an iconoclasm of complication rather than cancellation would be, well, let's tell the whole story of Kuiper. Let's read Kuiper against himself and show how he was inconsistent with his expansive vision of culture and the glory of God in all of these particular places, and name his racism, And so I think that this is an intuition that we can sort of follow through. The intuition of critical theory, unfortunately, too often leads to just the pulling down of everything, right? It has the ability to deconstruct and to destroy, but doesn't always have the resources to rebuild. And this is why I have a chapter on ethics or a moral vision, because it's not enough to simply kind of do iconoclasm. You also have to build something, right? You have to live in the world. And I think probably the issue with secular iconoclasm, and sometimes Christian iconoclasm as well, is that we get really good at pulling things down, but we don't really learn how to build institutions that are characterized by justice and righteousness and peace, or that are more characterized by justice and righteousness and peace. So I think that that's the way we can learn from critical theory, and sort of follow along with it, but then also even go further to say it's not just ideology, it's idolatry. And what do we do about idolatry? Yeah.
So in my own tradition, I grew up in Iowa, as anybody who listens to this podcast would know. I went to seminary at age 36, and the only reason I picked Covenant Seminary in St. Louis was because there was an association there with Francis Schaeffer, who I had read. I was not Presbyterian. I was not Reformed. I thought anybody who baptizes a baby probably isn't even a Christian. I didn't have a box for that. I kind of came in through the John Piper back door, decided to go to Covenant Seminary, ended up becoming Reformed, Presbyterian, planting a church in Iowa City. And so what I knew about the PCA is what I learned in seminary. And what I learned in seminary, the narrative that I learned about the PCA, was that the PCA was founded because during the Civil War, the two Presbyterian churches, the National Presbyterian Church, split in two. There was a Northern Presbyterian Church and a Southern Presbyterian Church, and the church had drifted and had become liberal. In the 1960s, there began negotiations about the two of them getting back together and merging, which they eventually did, back into the PCUSA, and that there were a number of churches in the South that were very concerned about the theological drift. And they decided in 1973 that they were going to form their own denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America, to keep on the path of confessional orthodoxy. And I went to plant a church, and I'm all about Tim Keller. I'm all about Francis Schaeffer. I'm planting this church in Iowa City, a university town, and I'm sitting across from a PCUSA minister in Iowa City. We're talking about disaster relief response. And at some point in the conversation, he goes, "Man, you do not seem PCA. I just don't see this in you at all." And I'm like, "Really? How so?" He's like, "Well, PCA is racist." I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, "Well, let me tell you the version of the PCA that we know, that I know here. And that is everything that you said, maybe, but the PCA, also those churches that left to form the PCA, weren't big fans of the civil rights movement. They were hosting sovereignty commission meetings, which are the people whose job it was to enforce the separate but equal codes in the South. They were hosting those meetings, and some of the writings of the earliest leaders of the PCA were very, very racist, and many of those churches were segregated. And I was completely befuddled by that. And then I was shocked to find out it was true. That both narratives, as you say about Kuyper, both things were true. He had a lot of great things to say and developed wonderful systems of theology and public engagement and all of that, as was the PCA and the Reformed thinking that came through that. And yet, it wasn't perfect. There were massive things wrong with it. But then what ends up happening, and I think we see this now within evangelical circles, as you say, this cancel culture, that what I think happens is that evangelical Orthodox Christians talk about we've got a big cancel culture out there. It's very bad. We have to fight against it. But if you say, hey, Kuyper was kind of a racist, then you get this cancel word. Well, you know what? You're woke. Now you're just woke, which is the evangelical go-to word of canceling somebody, of saying, you are presenting information to me now that I'm going to not even engage in, and I'm just going to shut it down by labeling you woke. Mm-hmm. And this idea of critical theory, of actually being able to think through that what's happening there is a power move, right? It is a power move. I'm going to shut you down without this. So as a person who spent a decade in pastoral ministry, tell us how we get through this as pastors. How do we navigate? Don't shake your head like that, like there's no hope. But like, this is what pastors are facing on a daily basis, is trying to say information that is often canceled as soon as it comes out of their mouth.
Yeah, I don't know, Michael. I'm not a minister at the moment. I do have many friends who are in ministry, some who have left ministry over the last few years and things like that. So I don't in any way want to minimize or say that it's easy. I think it's very difficult right now to be a pastor in this context. I think that the things that come to mind, however, are almost, maybe it's naive in some sense, or it's going to sound naive at least. And I think that what has to happen, so two things, as part of our imaginative discipleship, there has to be some sort of capacious and constructive vision that is beautiful, that captures the imagination of people. So I very strongly believe, I talk about in the book, this mantra, criticize by creating. The main reason I'm worried about the culture wars rhetoric is because you think about what it means to be in war and the trauma that is associated with feeling constantly under attack or constantly feeling like you must fight for every inch, the fog of war that, covers the field of engagement. And the sustainability, for Christian churches and movements to see themselves as always embattled, which is the reason why I've said that, moving towards a mentality of how do we engage in culture care, where we're caring for the spaces and the communities in which we find ourselves. And part of that is casting a beautiful vision of what we get to do, that is not defined primarily by resistance, but the resistance is that sort of created vision. It is the criticism that I make, is the constructive work I do, right? Is my participation in these beautiful things, right? And that's not to deny all of the ugliness. It's not to deny the complexity or the need for contestation or resistance. All of that obtains as well. It just cannot be the primary thing that defines who we are. I think the primary thing has to be the casting of a vision of the sufficiency of Christ, and the goodness of Christ and the comfort that we have in life and death, regardless of whether we win or lose culturally. the Martin Luther hymn, let goods and kindreds go, this mortal life also, the body they may kill, God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. Like, that's the vision, right? That vision of that there are some things more beautiful and lasting and better and important than winning at this moment in history if we have to sell our souls to do it. That's the first thing. And then the second thing that I'd say is I am just incredibly, incredibly encouraged by the ordinary work that pastors do. Part of my, saying the power dimension is not all that there is. I think a lot of times if you live on Twitter, or formerly Twitter, X, if you live on social media, you can begin to think that this sort of war of words is the only world that there is. This war in which people just fight, and the power dimension is the only one that there is. And I have just found, and perhaps this is in some ways because of my rural location, that most ordinary people are concerned with much more mundane things on a daily basis. They're worried about their kids. They're worried about the breast cancer diagnosis that they have. They're worried about, like the things that fill people's minds are much more mundane, and pastors get to walk with people in the midst of all of that, right? Pastors get to do ordinary pastoral care, helping people to live and die well. I just read a piece this morning from a former student of mine she is a chaplain, a pediatric palliative chaplain in New York City. And she's writing about doing the imposition of ashes in the hospital with children who have had, who have terminal diagnoses. And just think about how many Christians there are out there in pastoral ministry or otherwise that are, faithful presences in the face of all that life can give and all that death can take. And I think that's the way the church moves forward, is remembering that our mission and our work is much more mundane and ordinary and pastoral, than just fighting those big fights in the public sphere. Again, that there's a place for that as well. Like, that's an important thing to be a part of as well. But I think that for most ordinary believers, doubling down on the beauty of the gospel and the ordinary care for souls is the way that we sort of, well, I don't know if survive is the right word, the way that we are faithful in the midst of it all.
Yeah. So I had a question I was going to ask you, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask it next, meaning after the one I'm about to ask you, because I want to just pick up on what you said. So one of the things that frequently happens when we do a presentation at a church is I'll talk about these three eschatologies that are readily available to those in the kind of public square. That, we as Christians, we're familiar with, like, maybe there's dispensationalism, pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill, all that different stuff. But the political world has eschatologies too. And those who've listened to the show know where I'm going to go here. And the first one is called Make America Great Again. And the way that you know that it's an eschatology is it's making an assessment about the way things are now and a judgment about the vision about the way things should be. And it really kind of sees as like a person. There's an individual who can take us to that place. And when we get to that place, that's the way things should be, and they're going to be. The other one is called Build Back Better. And it also is an eschatology because it is, in its own words, making a statement about the way things are and the way that things could and should be. And it selects a leader that can take us there. The issue with both of those eschatologies is that very much kind of borrowing from Marx and from the whole idea of power and changing the world, is that those worldviews happening and occurring really rely on people doing work to make them happen. Like if you embrace this eschatology only comes about if you do the hard work of doing it. The third eschatology is called Making All Things New. And it also is, I mean, it's saying, hey, here's what is, and here's where we're going. And there is a person who can make that happen. And it's Jesus. And he doesn't require your work. In fact, that's what Peter gets in trouble for when Jesus is arrested, is Jesus thinks, hey, make Israel great again is about to come to an end. You must need me to, rush the temple guard. And so I bring this up in relationship to what you were saying about the mundane. And that is that, as you're right, most people are, why can't I get pregnant? Okay. So making America great again and building back better is not going to fix that problem for me. It's not going to fix the issue of my addicted child or my wife's breast cancer diagnosis, or the fact that we live in generational poverty and the father has disappeared, or that, the earth is warming. Like, these are not questions that are just resolved necessarily by kind of like a political ideology. That many people are literally just, the only hope they have is Jesus. That Jesus is going to come back and make everything the right way again. And yet it seems as though Christians spend a lot of their time in this kind of culture warring mentality, right? And so just talk a little bit about how the kind of like the way that in which Christians get diverted by these political eschatologies can really has an impact on the way, even maybe going back to the way the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex get fired, that the way in which that the eschatology that we adopt and decide to live by really has a lot to do with the way in which we're living in the world and the way in which we're choosing to engage culture. That was a long-winded question. But.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very thoughtful typology, I think. So I think that the central truth of covenant theology, or just broadly speaking, is that we cannot secure ourselves. We have to be secured by someone who will be faithful to us. And we are always looking for other ways of finding security, of securing ourselves, rather than the vulnerability of having to trust the promise of someone else. And so there are kinds of security that we can find, having an insurance policy or a home security system, or, there are sorts of securities that, we can find to protect our resources, our assets. But that's not the same kind of security as the security that you find in, for example, a marriage, where that your security is found in that this person has promised to be with me and for me. And the first kind is a sort of security from projecting what's going to happen, right? Sort of projecting what's going to happen in the future, predicting, all the bad things that could occur and preparing ourselves for it. And the second kind of security is the security that comes really through trusting promises, right? Which is the very heart of what Christians are meant to be doing every Sunday, of hearing the promise of the gospel and then receiving those promises through the sacraments. And so I think that this is connected to that sense of living out the story, right? That all of these stories, eschatologies, are ways of asking, where do we find our ultimate security? Where will we find our ultimate comfort in life and death? And it's easy for us to try to find our ultimate comfort in our ability to predict everything that could go wrong and try to mitigate that risk. And again, there's a place for that. But ultimately, that will not secure us. I mean, that is the central message of covenant in the Bible. And so I think that this humbles us profoundly. Covenant theology is meant to humble us profoundly, of saying that you're only secure because of someone who's promised to be faithful to you. You trust him, like you trust God's promises for you in Jesus Christ. And he has demonstrated through the risen body of Jesus Christ that the deepest reality in this world is not brutality, is not the war of all against all, but that the deepest reality is grace, right? And so I think that getting this into our bones, where we believe that the deepest reality is beauty, not brutality, and that grace is deeper than power, is the heart of what we're trying to form in people as in Christian discipleship, so that our intuitions are not cynicism and fear and despair, but that our intuitions are faith and love and hope. And so I think that it humbles us, Christian eschatology, knowing that our work is not the work that brings in the kingdom. Our work is not the work that saves the world. In some sense, it takes this incredible burden off of our shoulders, and allows us to rest, because the reality is, we may die. In fact, we will die, right?
Yes.
That's today. We're recording this on Ash Wednesday, right? So this is the day in which we are reminded that we are dust, and to dust we will return. And our work will die, right? And our institutions will die, right? And yet, right, that's the Christian hope, is that God reserves the right to raise things up again, right? Whether that is our bodies, or whether that is the work that we do. And so that means that we can offer our work in joy, and it can fail, and it can be forgotten, and it can feel like it doesn't really make a difference. I think about that. I give a lecture, or I write, or I preach a sermon, or I write a book, and it's not what I wanted it to be. And there's an incredible release that comes from saying, Lord, I offer this to you. This can die. This can go into the ground, and maybe God and His providence will raise it up and use it to bless other people. And so I think that's the heart of it, is the death and resurrection of Christ is that sense of being willing to die, to lose, to fail, to be forgotten, and yet to know that in God's economy, that none of those things are wasted, that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. And so I think that's the thing. To the degree that we feel like it is on us, we feel like it is our work that's going to save the world. It is, we are the ones who are going to bring the kingdom in. God is counting on us. To the degree that we believe that, our security, our sanity is going to be rooted in the success or failure of that mission. And we're going to see others who oppose that, or who are obstacles to that, as not our neighbors, but as our enemies, who then can be sort of summarily dismissed, silenced, excused, excluded, rather than loved, as we're commanded to. And so I think that is the very heart of this sort of Christian eschatology that says, you will die and God will raise you. I think that everyone wants to go to heaven. No one wants to die. Everyone wants to experience resurrection, but nobody wants to die first. And I think that just existential reality that all of us struggle with, that a lot of our culture making, that a lot of our political action is wrestling with, sort of, what's our legacy going to be? What's going to live on after we die, has to submit to the cross that says, no, you die with Christ, and your work dies with Christ, and God will raise it in the way that He sees fit, to His glory and to the good of others. And so I think, at least for me, it just has allowed me to breathe a lot easier and not put so much pressure on my work that I do. I want to do it for love and be faithful, and use all of my energy that I can to make a difference, for my neighbors and to the glory of God. But I'm thinking about this line from Tolkien in one of his letters, where he's talking about Frodo and how Frodo ultimately failed at the end to be able to give up the ring. And it says that Frodo used every last ounce of his energy to get as far as he could, and then the other powers took over. There's this sense that there are other powers at work in the world, and when we have done all that we can, perhaps they have another move.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying, I don't want to oversimplify this, is that Christians should absolutely develop the skill of discerning culture, navigating culture, and even engaging with culture, with the purpose of seeking the flourishing of the world through that. But the idea that Christians are losing the culture war, it's not possible. That we can't lose the culture war, because we're in Christ. And I'm just reminded of Paul at the end of Acts. he is in prison. He's been in the judicial system for basically 2.5 years. When Acts ends, he's going to be there for another 2 years. And when he asks to see the leaders and he speaks to them, they basically say, we don't have any letters about you. We don't know anything about you. The group that you're associated with, however, we do know about them, and they suck. They're pretty much bad news. And so most of them just leave. And Paul is left either being seen as irrelevant or extreme. And yet the last word of the book of Acts is unhindered. That things look bad, but things are in God's control. So I'm going to give you the last word to just kind of talk about how our Christian engagement in culture, and you were just talking about it, really Christians should be encouraged by this very position that Paul finds himself in.
Yeah. And when you were talking about that, I thought of the thing that Jesus says where he says, and some of you they will put to death, but not a head of your hair will perish. It's like, whoa, how do you put that together? There's this sense in which you're going to kill some of you, but you're not every hair of your head will be cared for, will be taken care of.
Yeah.
And so I think that's that ultimate sense of security. I mean, it's the reason why Christianity spread like wildfire in the midst of persecution is because death, the ultimate power of the powerful, which is to put you to death, is no longer powerful, right? Because of the resurrection of Christ and that hope that Christians had to be willing to lay down their lives. Again, I think that we are not in a place right at the moment where most of us are going to be called to lay down our lives for the gospel. But I think a similar sort of understanding obtains in terms of our willingness to be faithful and to entrust the results to the Lord in the midst of this. And so in the end of my book, I sort of unpack this in terms of faith, love, and hope and say, okay, faith leads to this sort of non-reductive curiosity. Because we have entrusted ourselves to the Lord and know that that's where we find our security, we're able to be curious rather than to jump to judgment on everything, right? We can ask questions. We can learn from our neighbors. We can learn from those with whom we disagree, because our ultimate security in the face of our vulnerability is not found in having all the answers or figuring it all out, but ultimately, so we can be in a time when it's so easy to be reductive and people are always trying to reduce and categorize each other and sort of sort people and caricature them. Christians ought to be those who are moving in the opposite direction, that are just curious about learning about others because our security is not found in not being them, right? And then secondly, I say love ought to lead to a non-dismissive discernment. So discernment, yes, that's part of what we are meant to do as Christians, is to learn to choose between what's right and wrong, to learn to choose between what is good and evil, between the better and the best, all of those things that discernment means. But it always ought to be a non-dismissive discernment where we refuse to dismiss those neighbors who have been made in God's image. Because it's very easy for us to just sort of avoid ever exposing ourselves to people with whom we disagree and to be just really dismissive of people who are made in God's image. And so I think that discernment, yes, but it ought to be non-dismissive. And then finally, hope leads to this idea of non-anxious presence, which has been written about by many people recently, and it's a term from a Jewish psychiatrist, Edwin Friedman, and this is the idea of being able to be present without the need to be in control, without the need to win, right, without the need to have the last word, and I think that because we have hope, right, because of the hope of the gospel, this allows us to cultivate this posture of non-anxious presence. And again, these are matters of emotional discipleship, of spiritual formation, of imaginative discipleship. And it's not just enough to teach people all of the Heidelberg Catechism or whatever it is, all of the things from the Bible study. We also have to really be attending to the ways that we're being spiritually formed, the things that are, filling our minds, the things that we're obsessing over, and have to learn to disciple the imagination, our own imaginations, but also the imaginations of the people that we serve and that we lead, with more beautiful stories. And I think that's the other piece that we need a lot of leadership from the aesthetic dimension of people telling stories and singing songs, and because these are the technologies that get to the heart of things, that capture the imagination. And I think because we have sort of had an impoverished imagination in conservative Christianity, we have been rendered ourselves quite vulnerable to celebrity and to those sorts of things that we're vulnerable in particular ways to spectacle, and maybe that's a human problem. Maybe that's a living in 2024 problem and not just a church problem. But the church ought to be, because we have the best story ever told, the most beautiful story ever told. We ought to be able to tell stories that hint at that draw out people's affections towards a more beautiful vision of what could be, even if we find ourselves unable to realize it on this side of the eschaton.
Okay, well, I really wanted to give you the last word, and I wish that I could not be talking right now, because you've just landed us in just absolutely the best place. I can't think of a better way to start the 2024 season of the Faithful Presence than having you on. This has been, just for me, a wonderful joy. I want to thank you very much for coming on. Before we go, is there anything we can be praying for you? I know that today is Ash Wednesday, but as a married man, I know that it's also Valentine's Day. So this is your reminder right now. If you've
Thank you. Yeah. I've been reminded of that already today. Yeah.
Any prayer requests? How our listeners and viewers can pray for you?
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I am trying to finish the manuscript for a third book, and this is a book about the imagination and prayer and the way that those things are related to each other. So not about praying with more imagination necessarily, but the way that practices of prayer and really Christian discipleship, but really an attentiveness to God, and everything that prayer is, might orient us to live in the world differently, so that we can actually continue to be faithfully present in the places where we are. And I'm in the last lap of it. I'm writing the last 10,000 words or so, and it's like every single word is a pain, So I'm hoping to finish it within the next few weeks, and I would appreciate just prayer that as it goes through revisions and things like that, the Lord would give wisdom and clarity of thought, and help me to like it better and things like that. to feel better about it. It's like a creative project. You're like, oh, I love it. Oh, I hate it.
Right.
Oh, this is brilliant. Oh, everybody said this before. This is not new. So I think that I'm sort of riding that creative roller coaster as I write about a book about prayer, as I find it hard to pray, while I'm writing a book about prayer. I think that would probably be the main prayer request for the work I'm doing right now.
That's a good prayer request. I know that I planted a church in Iowa City, and the church now, since I've left, has bought a building, and they're directly across the street from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Okay.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah. And so over the course of my time there, and even now, there are people who attend that church who are in the workshop. And after a couple years of being there, I could almost set my clock by the phone call. Hey, can we meet to talk? Yes, sure. What would you like to talk about? I am a failure. I am the worst writer in the world. I made a horrible decision coming here. I don't even know what I'm doing. I feel like a turd. And I'm like, and I was, so the first time I didn't know what was happening. After that, I'm like, oh, did you get workshopped today? Yeah, I did. They ripped my story apart and told me that there was basically nothing redeemable and of no value in it. And, so here you are, a professional writer, submitting your stuff to editors whose job it is to go through and say, I know that you really loved this passage, but it has to go. So we will pray for you, because it is,
Yeah, thank you.
That is a very hard thing to put yourself out there like that. Justin, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. That's it for this episode, the first episode of 2024's Faithful Presence podcast. Want to thank Dr. Bailey for joining us. Thank you for his work. Hope that you will pick out a copy of this book, Interpreting Your World. It's available on all the various book outlets. You should absolutely pick up a copy of it. We'll have some other podcasts coming soon. I don't know which one we're going to get edited first, but there are others in the pipeline. Thank you to our post-production team, the people who make this possible. But with all that said, may our Father in heaven make you one, as he and his Son are one, so that the world will know that he loves them and sent his Son for them. Amen. Continue on, my people. Bye-bye.